is 100% your water to paint ratio. 100%. And all this stuff that I'm going to say today is more or less going to be pretty similar to what I was saying last week. Some tinted water here. But it's placing that water down first. It's entirely up to you on how long you want to wait. If you want the water to kind of soak into the paper first, if you want to just put the paint right in, how wet your paint is. There are lots of different factors to affect how it's going to look on your paper. So one good thing is just to maybe cut your paper in half and just do wet on wet, waiting after a little bit here and there. But I'll do one side, putting it on right now, and then I can do one side when it's damp as well. So that's wet on wet, freshly putting in, right? And we're gonna wait a little bit. Next is wet on dry. You're gonna have definitely a different look to it. You're most likely gonna still see your brush strokes. You can have a little bit more control with it, but once you do wet on dry and you want to go back to it, you're not working wet on dry anymore. At that point, you're going to be working wet on wet. Now, one thing to consider, one difference between wet on wet and wet on dry is the color saturation. Your colors are going to look a lot more saturated wet on dry simply because there's less water. Right? If you're doing wet on wet, you're putting stuff into water. That's going to lighten over time. You should expect that this is going to lighten as this goes. It's not going to stay this dark, guarantee you.
So that pear picture I showed you with all the layering of color, then I was working dry on dry then?
You were working wet on dry?
I thought it was wet on dry, but you're saying once you go back, it's not wet on dry anymore.
If I were to go back right now with a different color,
I mean after it was dry.
So if I wait for this to dry, then it's wet on dry again.
Oh, it is, okay.
Yeah. But if I were to go like this.
Now, because, yeah, it's wet already.
Yep.
With color on it, okay.
So it's going to have that wet on wet effect.
Yeah, now I understand.
And I'll just.
And you'd want to do that in what instance, when you're trying to achieve what? Going in on a wet, like that, because you got a really nice blue going there.
Yeah.
I mean, wouldn't you be muddying it?
Maybe.
Uh-huh.
I guess you'll have to wait and see until we're further in the paper. But there are instances where you might want to go back. There might be instances. So after waiting for this area to dry, one, you can see the paint kind of reaching out, right? And if I were to wait maybe 10, 20 more minutes, it would reach out even further and the edges would soften. It's not going to look super veiny like that. I'm going to go ahead and put in some wet on wet after maybe waiting, what, like 5-ish minutes? Around 5. Just on this edge. It's still wet on wet, but I guess I would consider it more wet on damp, right? Dry and dry is really fun if you're trying to do textures. Let's grab some fresh paint in that case. What blue was I using there? I'll just go to good old Prussian. It's one of my favorite blues. I love using Prussian blue, as you can tell by the lowness of the bottle. One tip, when you start to get paint around here, this can be really hard to open because you're just getting paint gunked around the edges. So every once in a while, just take a wet paper towel, just clean those ridges, right? Because that's just dried paint. And if you are twisting the life out of your cap and your tube like this, you might rip it.
Yeah.
So try to keep that twisted area nice and clean. It'll be good for the longevity of your tubes, and you won't have broken tubes like me. I can already feel the paint starting to harden. It still works, but maybe one day I'll just cut it and squeeze the rest out into something else. And already you can see the difference between the two blues with the wet on wet versus the wet on dry, just in color saturation alone. You can also kind of see the difference between how far the paint is spreading. It's not going to spread as much if you wait. Wet on dry. Oh, let me get a little bit of moisture into this paint here. Dry brush if I can. Dry your brush as much as you can. Wet on dry is really good for texture, especially if you have very textured paper. This is cold press. If you have rough, that's when dry brushing really starts to shine. And it's a lot easier to do dry and dry when you're kind of in the flow of your painting, you know? Again, you don't really want a wet brush. I suggest if you're trying to go for some dry brushing, test it out in a little scrap paper, see how it's looking. Right there. That's a pretty good moisture level.
Maybe too dry.
Too dry, right? Usually when I'm like 2 hours in, I get a pretty good feel for my paints, but right there.
It's like dry brushing.
Right?
Yeah.
It looks like a dry brush. That's really good for wood textures, plant textures, all sorts of textures, or if you're just trying to create an interesting visual element to it. That looks really good when it's layered as well.
So if you layered it, you would do the dry on dry again once that's dry?
Yeah,
And it would be-
like if I wanted to layer the dry and wet on dry, just create an interesting visual look to it. Next, I would want to talk about blending different colors, and then probably get into layering. If y'all can ever create a color sheet that is really, really good, it is painting a swatch of each tube that you have. That way you know exactly how it's going to look on your paper, right? You're not kind of surprised as to how a color is going to look on paper. But another thing that's good to do below that is if you do each color up top, like, I have one sitting somewhere. I haven't been able to find it. Is underneath it doing a value scale. I can show you a quick value scale as well. Using blue, of Prussian blue. Now there are two different ways to kind of desaturate your colors. You can mix Payne's gray with it, which is kind of like a grayish black. Right? That's gonna change the value. You can add a complementary color to it. That's a fun way that I like to kind of desaturate a color.
I never remember that.
Mm-hmm. It's a fun trick. It's so fun. I love it.
I usually just add more water to get a lighter value.
Or you can add more water, right? So add more water or just kind of run out the brush. I like to do a nice value scale. That already is kind of a pretty light value. The more paint you have, the darker the value / darker the saturation of your color is going to be. But the more you go, the lighter it gets. That is something to consider. If you're just going wet on dry, and you are continuously just moving on to different areas, or you're making different marks and stuff, it is going to progressively get a little bit lighter. You might want to add a little bit of water to it. Even just dip right there. Just adding some more water.
Got a nice brick wall going.
Right? You can always go back to adjust some darker values with just straight up more paint. Dark value squares. You can test value using layering. I haven't adjusted too much. But just know, the more you use it, the less paint's going to be on your brush.